Hello there, everybody, and welcome into this session today. My name is Stephen Ball, and I'm just moderating the session today. Online to take you through is Stuart Ashworth, our MVP from the UK. Hi, Stuart.
Morning, everyone.
So I know Stuart's going to introduce himself as he gets going, so I'll leave him get on with that. But if you have any questions today, please go ahead and use the chats on the GoToWebinar control panel if you're watching this live. If you're watching it on demand, then feel free just to reach out to us on the Sencha website through the sales, or you can just pop a message over to Stuart and he can help redirect you as needed. So Stuart, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So welcome everyone to the webinar. Today we're going to talk about Sencha versus open source and how Sencha products, or Ext JS in particular, we're going to focus on today, compare with the open source alternatives that are available out there at the moment. So we'll just dive in straight with that. So it's a quick summary about me. I've been working with Sencha for over 10 years now and been part of the MVP program since it started. I've written a few books on Ext JS, and there's a new one in the works at the moment. So if you want to check out, there's a URL there you can go to see. And yeah, so I've been working building large-scale applications with Ext JS for a number of years now. So hopefully I've got some experience that I can share with everyone today. And you can all get something useful from the session. So this format today, we're just going to do a short presentation about Sencha versus open source and the advantages of using Sencha's sort of proprietary software over open source alternatives. There'll be some time at the end for Q&A. As Stephen said, if you've got any questions as you think of them, just fire them in the questions panel, and we can either come to them if I spot them and it's sort of relevant about what I'm talking about at the moment. I'll try and address it. If you want to keep it to the end, we can go through them all at the end. That's fine. And then if we have time, we can have a bit of an informal discussion if people want to jump onto the open mics, and we can have a chat about questions you have or any points that you've thought of during the session, and we can discuss those and see if we've got some answers for you for anything that comes up. So we'll start off just by sort of defining a few terms that sort of get thrown about and make sure we all sort of understand the meaning of them and how they fit in with everything. So the term open source, it describes software whose code is freely available for anyone to read and use. And more often than not, these days, that means it's a project that's available on GitHub or Bitbucket or another sort of repository platform like that. And you're free to browse the code and download it and use it in your projects. And open source software is generally free to use, but they all have a license that's defined in the project, and it sets out how it can be used. So this can range from a GPL license, which permits free use, but anything that's built with it should also be open source and fall under that same license, all the way to something like MIT license, which essentially permits users to do anything with the software as long as you retain the sort of original copyright and license notice. And so there's a large spectrum of different licenses, all with slightly nuanced differences and the permissions that they allow. And because of the nature of open source, they're being freely available and free to use, they're generally developed and maintained by individuals or groups of individuals that with a sort of single project owner or group of people that are the project owner acting as the sort of product manager that we might see in sort of internal projects. And usually these contributors are volunteers, just working in their free time for just a vested interest in the project. But increasingly we're seeing open source projects being supported by sponsors and donations by the companies that use them, which allows these core developers to to dedicate more time to the project and have a bit more of a formal relationship with the project. In terms of support provided with open source projects, generally it's just all support comes from the community of users and the small number of maintainers that the project has. So this means that any queries or issues you have, you can post to the public forums or the project's repository issues pages, but you're kind of at the mercy of people, hoping that someone in the community is able to help you, and you can get the answer that you need to get you moving again. So there's a bit of a you're relying on the people's generosity of time when it comes to getting support. So on the flip side of this, the alternative to open source software is closed source or proprietary software. So this is software that is not freely available, and the source code is kept private. Things like Microsoft Office or Photoshop, they'd all be considered closed source projects. And unlike open source projects, proprietary software tends to be created and maintained by a single entity. So there's usually a company or an individual that is backing the project and that is in control of the product direction, the code, and everything that goes along with it. So instead of open source with the free licenses, with closed source, people users buy licenses to the software, and that lets them either just use it as they might do with Microsoft Office, just use it and produce whatever you need to produce, or in terms of like Ext JS, where it's a framework that you're building on top of to build your own products. So you pay for a license to use it, and you can then do with it as you wish within your project. And in terms of support, as you're paying customers, you sort of have an expectation of a level of support that's provided by the author and the company that distributes the software. So there might also be a form of community support in addition to the sort of official support channels, but that'll depend on the popularity of the product and the community that it's sort of generated. So where does Ext JS fit into this landscape of open and closed source? So it's a slightly unique product, and it kind of fits into where it fits into these two camps. So it's a proprietary piece of software, and it's sold with a commercial license. The additional suite of tools, the Sencha Test, Sencha Architect, etc., they're all distributed as closed source pieces of software that come as the part of the commercial offering. However, Ext JS also has an open source license, which allows users to use it for free in accordance with the GPL v3 license. And generally, the difference between the two sort of offerings is that the open source version is maybe a release cycle or two behind the commercial version. So with the commercial version, you get access to nightly builds and the immediate releases when they're available. Which means you get patches and new features much faster. And although its code base is closed source from the stance that it isn't freely available on something like GitHub, it is available to view within the limits of the license. So obviously by nature, the JavaScript frameworks are impossible to be completely closed source, as the code is sent down to the client's browser when you deliver your application. So even if it's minified or whatever, it's still visible to the user. So in that way, the Ext JS framework isn't completely closed source from that point of view. So what are the open source alternatives to Ext JS? So the current big three that we always come to mind are React, Vue.js, and Angular. These are the most popular choices at the moment, and there's a few other smaller options gaining popularity, such as Svelte, which is another one which takes a different approach and is a similar sort of license model to these three. But generally, it's when you start conversations about what frameworks to use, these are the three that are going to come up as alternatives. So they're all a great choice for creating reactive web applications. But when you choose to develop an application with one of these, you're not just choosing it, you're choosing to develop it with a large number of additional third-party packages, both open and closed source potentially. And this need to introduce a huge number of additional dependencies is, in my eyes, the biggest shortcoming going down the open source route, which we'll discuss a lot about during the session. So when people try to compare JavaScript frameworks, they try to compare Ext JS with one of the big three libraries that we mentioned before, React, Vue, or Angular. but it's not really an apples to apples comparison. So if you select Vue, for example, as your open source library of choice, then you then need to pick a UI framework, so something like Bootstrap. So that's, you know, sort of orange level in the diagram here. And then you need to select something to handle your data. So you might pick Vuex if you have a Vue application, and then you need something to handle AJAX calls, so you bring in Axios, and then you need to do some date handling, so you would go and grab Moment.js, and yeah, sort of keep going down this thinking as all your requirements get met. And when you compare ExtJS, what it has to offer, it has all of these things all built in, all part of the same package. So really, when you're comparing ExtJS to one of these big three, to get an apples to apples comparison, you have to include all of these other packages that you bring in when you start your project. So you're comparing ExtJS as one thing with potentially 10, 20, 30 different packages all needing to work together to bring that feature parity between the two. So that's the key thing that when you do this sort of comparison, is that you have to take into account that you're not just comparing Vue and ExtJS or Angular and ExtJS, you're comparing Vue plus all the extra bits that you need to have a full application framework. So with that all in mind, we'll talk about some of the advantages of ExtJS and Sencha products over the open source alternatives. So as we talked about before, we're to bring the feature parity between ExtJS and the open source version alternatives, you need to include a whole host of new packages and libraries to get the functionality you need to build a complete application. So when you do that, your first task is to build a framework of your own instead of focusing on your application. So immediately you've got a prerequisite task of putting together a framework that will cover all the requirements that you have. All the packages will work nicely together, and all the packages are, you've had to evaluate all these different ones and make these decisions. So there's a lot of, that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and there's decisions to be made at every level. And with every selection that you make, there's a wee bit of risk involved. So, you're bringing in another dependency to your project, and that has an inherent risk involved in it, just like any other part of your application stack. So ExtJS has 90% or more of what you need to build a complete enterprise level application from start to finish. There might be wee bits and bobs here and there that you need to bring in third-party libraries for, but generally speaking, you're going to get 90% of the way there with what ExtJS has to build in. So that's one decision. That's one risk factor, that you're taking into account, and that lets you just dive straight in and focus on building your application, because your customers don't really care that you've made these decisions on 20 different open source libraries that build the application. They just care about the value that your application is delivering to them, and so that's what we as developers should be focusing on, and not getting bogged down in all the other decisions. So the other big advantage of ExtJS as a sort of complete toolkit solution is that everything is built to a consistent standard. So this is impossible to achieve when you're using lots and lots of smaller libraries from all different authors who all have different goals and different standards of their own. So when you're building with ExtJS, you know that all the components and all the features will work reliably across a defined set of browsers and platforms, and they've been developed with these requirements in mind and tested accordingly. So you might find that when you're putting together your open source application framework, some components might work in down to a certain version of Internet Explorer. Some might only support the evergreen modern browsers. Some might go all the way down to IE6 support. All these different levels that libraries can support, and there's not going to be a consistent level that they all work to. And similarly, all the components have been created to meet strict accessibility standards and been tested to meet to comply with all the rules and the compliance standards that you have with accessibility, which is really important in applications. So open source libraries, they all might have varying degrees of compliance across them all. So either you have to try and update the ones that have, you know, slightly lacking support and bring them up to in line, or you have to put that package to one side and try and find another one which does fit in with that to give you a solid line of compliance across the board. Another important factor is just components that follow the same design and style patterns, so that they look, you know, seamlessly look the same across your application. So if your components are from all different sources, they likely have to put in a bit of extra work to try and get their look and styling to feel consistent. And the interactions are maybe slightly different too. So there's all these different factors that you might have to try and smooth over to get a consistent look and feel. And I know that these things aren't show-stopping issues, but they require a bit of time and effort to check and correct if you have to. And if you do have to add code to, you know, to correct them or bring them into a sort of consistent line, then that's extra maintenance that you have to deal with. And as things upgrade, you know, you have to continually maintain these sort of patches as new versions are released. So it's a big thing to take into consideration when you're making the decision. So in dealing with all these different packages, there's likely to be issues with interoperability. So they might not all you know, work together in the same way. They might not talk to each other in the same way, which makes it a lot harder to just you know, just get working on your application. So you're having to deal with these little issues where one component you know, has an interface that's slightly different to another, and they won't quite talk to each other properly. So in order to sort of get around that, we maybe have to write some extra adapter code to make them, you know, talk nicely to each other. And like we said before, that adds a bit of fragility and it adds extra code that, you know, you don't really need in your application. Some extra stuff to maintain. The other issue is potential interference between the packages. So this is something that happens with, more commonly with styling, where the styling might conflict. You know, you have a sort of style in one component that catches a lot of other elements in other components and causes them to, you know, their styling to get thrown off. And so you have to add some extra code to try and nullify that conflict. So again, it's not show-stopping things, it's not hugely difficult things, but just another thing you have to worry about, have to think about, and have to maintain. And finally, one thing to think about is that each of these packages will have their own little boilerplate code with helper utilities and polyfills and that sort of thing. And if each of them has their own polyfill for one method, then you're having to include that code in, you know, multiple times, which is you know, duplication is waste, and it's going to add to your the size of your application that has to go down the wire, and you know, just lead to a bigger footprint, slower download speeds, all that sort of stuff. Whereas something like ExtJS, where everything is built under the same umbrella, you know, they're sharing all that boilerplate code. All the different components know that there's these utility methods that are available, and it can be just dipped into and grabbed and used without having to include them themselves. And that leads to a bit more of a smooth operation of each of the components, and you know, doesn't lead to bloated file sizes because of duplication of code. So obviously, the reliability of the frameworks that we work with is really important. We have to trust that the authors have performed, you know, detailed and exhaustive testing of their code. With closed source options, you know, the company that is building them and backing them, we can trust that they have put in the same level of testing by a dedicated team of, you know, qualified QA engineers to get us to that level of reliability and quality that we expect. The difficulty with open source projects is that we don't know for sure what that standard is for each of them. And when we're dealing with multiple packages, you know, that standard is going to be different for all of them. And we just, you know, we don't have that level of trust that everything is going to be developed and tested to the standard that we desire. So some of the packages might have good test coverage and good testing procedures, and other ones might just be, you know, a single developer that's putting out a quick release, and he's just not got the bandwidth to perform the rigorous testing that that ExtJS is able to do with their, you know, with their dedicated teams. And that's just the nature of the open source world. And it's, you know, everyone would love to have, you know, exhaustive test plans and excellent test coverage and things, but the reality is that the time just doesn't allow for that, especially when it's small teams working on these projects in their spare time. It's also impossible to be sure of the code quality and reliability of each of these packages that we're relying upon. All will have different code review processes and different standards, and we just don't know what those are. Obviously, we can go in and inspect the code ourselves, but again, that's another time and task that we have to fit into our already busy, you know, project schedules. So obviously, this doubt in these things creates a lot of risk for the project, and so we have to just include that risk evaluation in our decision-making process. And so to try and mitigate the risk that using all these open source packages presents, we then have to sort of design and perform even more stringent testing of our applications to make sure that we, you know, create a sort of standard level of testing that we're happy with. And that, obviously that costs time and money, and will impact our delivery times and budgets and things, which might not be required quite as strongly if we've got, you know, if we are happy with the testing standards that the closed source projects have been able to put together, because we can focus on our application code and we don't need to sort of worry about the edge cases of each of the components individually. So another massive factor when trying to mitigate the risks involved in a project is determining what support is available to your team should they run into you know, problems while they're developing with it. So obviously when you buy a commercial ExtJS license, you get access to the direct support channels where you can contact you know, experienced software support engineers who can hopefully quickly help you with your query or with your problem, and get it sorted and get you back to developing, and that's usually comes with a sort of guaranteed response time and that sort of thing. So there's a sort of level of you know, formal support that's available. On the flip side, with open source projects, the support you can expect varies wildly from project to project. So you're kind of at the mercy of the maintainers and community who are volunteering their free time, and they aren't able to help everyone in a timely fashion. Or even at all. There's often, you know, you see tickets or Stack Overflow questions where there's just no, you know, there's no answers there, and you know, whoever's posed the question has just had to muddle on and try their best to get around it in their own way. So the good thing about this is the bigger open source projects obviously have very large dedicated communities, and so you do see a lot of active you know, activity in forums and on things like Stack Overflow, so they're often able to help. But again, it's an unknown risk. You might post a question with an urgent issue on Monday, and you know, you don't get a reply till the next Monday or even later. Whereas if you've got the backing of, you know, of a commercial license software, then you know there's a support team that are, you know, able to help you whenever you need it. The other thing with having the dedicated team behind the software is that you know, critical patches and bug fixes can be released faster, and you know, you know when you'll get information on when that will happen, and hopefully they'll be able to get that done quickly. You know, open source is a wee bit more woolly in terms of will the patch get created and how long will it take, that sort of thing. So that's really critical to be able to get these bug fixes patched and fixed, especially if they're security related. You want them to be dealt with fast. And finally, the documentation that supports product is, you know, is critical for developers' productivity. Having a complete and consistent set of documentation really makes things a lot easier to work with. All projects, they create their own documentation in a different way, and so it means you have to jump between different formats and different styles, and finding things becomes a little bit trickier because you're having to deal with different systems and different layouts and all that. It's a small issue, but having the sort of completeness and the quality that, in one place, you can find what you need and you know where everything lives because of that consistency, which is really important. So the last big thing to think about when choosing open source is licensing. And as I said before, there are so many different types of open source license out there, and it's very likely that your developers haven't fully understood the ins and outs of each one and how they affect the product. We're all guilty of just, if we're working in sort of NPM land, just grabbing a quick package from there to do some task. Don't really take the time to read the license, fully understand it, and appreciate how it will impact your project and how it works with all the other ones that you're also using. So that's the big thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that the dependent packages, some of their licenses are likely to clash with each other. So you need to be really careful to avoid this in the first instance and manage this over time as you introduce new packages and new libraries, and knowing what libraries you're using and what license types they have, and how this new one that you're introducing will impact the existing other ones. And it might be that the licenses aren't compatible and you just won't be able to use it for that reason, forgetting about whether it's fulfills the requirements that you need. It's also possible that a package's license will change over time as new versions get released. So what was once fine when you started out with the library might not be compatible with the other licenses when you go to upgrade the new version to get the new bug fixes, the new patches, the new features. And that sort of puts you in an awkward position where you need to either stick with the old version with the old license, the compatible license, or you have to try and find an alternative that ticks all the same boxes. So you need to put some systems in place in your team to manage and monitor all these licenses, all the ones that you're working with, and how they can affect your software and your business. And it's a time-consuming task. It requires quite a lot of knowledge of the licenses and all their nuances. So it might be that you need to, get some outside help that has a lot of knowledge on these things to really be sure that what you're working with is okay. And following from that, if you don't put in that effort when you need to, you run the risk of inviting lawsuits if you've violated some terms of the license, either knowingly or unknowingly. And obviously this can be a really costly thing to deal with, and it puts a lot of stress on everyone in the business and the business itself. So that's obviously something you really want to avoid. So if you opt for sort of a complete proprietary solution like Ext JS, you don't have the huge number of moving parts with all different licenses and all that risk that it brings up, and it keeps things nice and simple. So that's a huge issue to have to deal with, and one that's probably not brought up as often as it should. So just a quick summary of what we've chatted about. When you're comparing Ext JS and open source projects, you have to really compare apples to apples. So that's comparing Ext JS with its full, wide feature set to all the multiple open source packages that you need to use to get to that same level of features. So you're not just comparing Ext JS and Vue and Ext JS and Angular. You're comparing Ext JS with Vue plus all the extra additional packages that are required to get all the features you need to build a fully featured application. So, and open source libraries, they won't be the same in terms of consistency. Their standards are always going to be different. So you have to factor that into your testing and your the quality that you expect from your application. Some libraries will have interoperability issues. Some won't work well together. Some will have to have adapter code put in to bridge those gaps. And that's something you have to think about when you're selecting all the different libraries that you use together, and it's like budget time for dealing with that. The additional overhead, testing overhead that you might need to provide to guarantee consistent quality is something you have to take into account. This might be whether you have to add in a whole new level of testing to your project to sort of cover all the edge cases of the libraries that you're using. So that has to be taken into account. So open source doesn't often have dedicated support channels, so you have to think about how you get support when you need it, and whether it's critical fixes or issues or just small things that you need help with. You have to understand where that support's going to come from and how you're going to get it how you're going to get yourselves unstuck if you get problems. And finally, dealing with all the different licenses that all these different packages use. They're often, there's not one standard license everyone uses, so you have to be aware of all the license types, aware of all the types that your dependency they're using, and that can be a bit of a minefield and something that you have to be very wary of to avoid getting into any legal trouble further down the line. There's a few different recommended reading that you might want to take a look at. There's a white paper from Sencha with sort of summary of these sorts of problems, which is really useful to have a look at if you want to read up on that. And there's a couple other sort of analysis reports on open source projects from the last couple of years, which are really useful to sort of take a look at how other people analyze the risks in open source and the security problems and all that sort of stuff, and see, just take that into account when you're making decisions for your project. So thank you very much for listening. Hopefully that's given you some insight into the comparison of the open source and the ExtJS worlds. The slides are up on that URL on the screen at the moment if you want to grab them to look at later on. And as I said before, if there's any questions, if you want to put them in the webinar software, we can go through each one and have a chat about that. Otherwise, thank you very much for dropping in, and hopefully see you in the future webinars that are coming up.
Brilliant, thank you, Stuart. So everyone, I'm just going to launch a quick poll here just to help us understand a little bit about you guys, and also to help focus through for some of the future sessions that we've got coming up. So if you could just quickly tell us which best describes you. Are you not using Sencha yet? Are you actively trialing it? Are you using it in development, or are you using it in development and production? Let's see, just over 40% of you have replied so far. Okay, it's giving us a good indication. I'll just leave that for a few more seconds, then we'll close that poll down. Just over half of you using it in production, which is good, and then a good number of you looking to use it and trialing it at the moment, which is great. So I'd certainly say we are actively looking at what content we're going to be putting into these Sencha cafes over the coming weeks and months. So if you've got any topic areas that you'd like us to cover, or any specific things that you'd like to hear more about, please go ahead and leave a comment in the questions as well. That's always really, really useful to kind of help make sure that we can feed you guys what you need to help you. We fully appreciate that it's very hard keeping up with everything in today's modern world. And if there's specific topic areas that you need more feedback on or more help around to help your adoption and use of Sencha, then please feel free to pass those kind of comments in here, and we'll certainly do our best to get those covered in the forthcoming sessions.
Steve, I see that someone has their hand raised on the.
Okay, so yeah, I was going to say, we had a message from Martin earlier just saying thanks for the talk, really useful. He's having to dash to another meeting. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and just make it available for anybody to unmute if they have a question that they want to ask Stuart.
Hello, good morning.
Hi, John.
Yes, this is John Ongwae from Systec Limited. We actually use Ext JS 7.4 in production and also in development. And for those who are looking forward to be joining this session or to be using Ext JS, through experience, I can actually compliment them and also encourage them to actually look at the documentation. It's actually so extensive. And I don't regret joining or buying the Ext JS license. So I really appreciate this, and also I'm looking forward for the upcoming session. And on the same note, with regard to what you might prepare is basically we have an issue with the routing process. So we will be able to take us through the routing process on how someone comes, generates the application and does that one in just from scratch up to a certain point. Then I really appreciate that one for this case. And also just on another note to the team is that Ext JS actually provides a well support portal which you can be able to raise your concerns, and actually they take little or minimum time to respond. So I'd actually appreciate and recommend it to everyone. Thanks.
Thanks, John, for sharing your experience. Great to hear that you're having a good time and enjoying using Sencha, which is really nice. Thank you. Yeah, Glenn's put a message into the chat saying some future sessions around model view controller and model view model. Certainly, talking to one of the other MVPs in the last week, he was saying certainly the data model and the way that Sencha helps you with the management of data and caching of data and that kind of side of things is one of the biggest reasons he uses it as well. Beyond just kind of the UI elements, the whole kind of data management is a fantastic option. So we can certainly look at doing something around data and how we can kind of manage your business logic out onto the UIs as well. That's a great idea, Glenn. Thank you. Okay, there's a couple other little questions in here which we'll follow up with a couple of the guys afterwards on because they're asking something pretty specific around their own projects, and obviously with the recordings going up for this, we want to make sure that we kind of keep this as generic as possible. And I think that's one that we potentially just kind of start getting into some business specifics that might just be on the edge of confidential for them. So I think you know who you are, so we'll follow up with you afterwards. Okay, great. Stuart, that's a really good session. Thank you very much. Any other final comments for anybody before we close out? Okay, I didn't see any other hands raised. So with that then, just leaves me to say thank you to Stuart for joining us today and for taking us through. Please make sure you do grab hold of the slides and wherever you are, if you have any other ideas or comments that you'd like to feedback on, or if you want to kind of have a bit of time to chat through your project and your plans, we are here to help and support you to help you move forward. So please feel free just to reach out, and then we'll kind of chat to you soon. Stuart, there's another quick question here. Is Glenn was asking about any plans for an updated book.
Yeah, so it's in the works at the moment, still quite early stages, but I'm hoping to try to release it as it's being written, if that makes sense. So rather than being a big bang at the end, I'll hopefully have something to deliver as things go, as things get written and produced. So hopefully in the coming couple of months there'll be something to see. And if you if you go to the website, you can stick your email in, and I'll make sure you're up to date with all the updates.
Yeah, I think we can safely say from Glenn then that's probably a request for the MVC and MVVM section of your book to be. Great. Okay, guys, thanks very much for joining us. Thank you, Stuart, for the excellent session, and please make sure you're registered up for next week and the coming weeks, and look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.